This past Thursday, July the 28th, we had a episode on Honey Badger Radio entitled The Future of Men's Rights, Anti-Feminism, and Everything. On that episode, I presented some prepared statements that I would like to present now separately from that, in addition with some additional commentary. When we ask what the future of men's rights is, I think we're asking a bigger question. We're asking what the future of culture, of society, of our species is. We're asking if we're going to end up growing and changing, or incinerating ourselves in a gigantic bloom of soot black mushroom clouds. In my opinion, the fractures we see around us, the chaos in our academic institutions, the social unrest, the ethical cannibalism, are the stress lines of deeper forces, and that deeper force is the inability of our current society to come to grips with the notion of men's rights. And the reason why our society can't come to grips with the notion of men's rights is because every society needs a scapegoat. Cis-het men are ours. Cis-het men are, as oppressor classes go, very unusual, and that they're the first oppressor class in human history that's more likely to be cleaning up the shit, I mean the literal shit, of the group they oppress, the cis-het women they oppress, than the reverse. And if you question whether or not this is true, just think about what the gender of a sewer worker, what the gender of an average sewer worker is. All the problems of the human soul are on display here. Societies need a scapegoat because we don't know how else to compel the cooperation to run a society without someone to hate. And for the same reason men are always in sewers cleaning up women's shit, they're also the ones who are easiest to hate and blame. So when I say the future of men's rights is the future of the human race, I'm not exaggerating. Tragedy creates the opportunity for self-knowledge. Self-knowledge creates wisdom, and wisdom is the practice of truth. And truth is the bedrock of real change. I'm also saying this. We need to start looking at men's rights not as a problem, but as the solution to the problem. Because men's rights asks us a profound, possibly ultimate question. Can we be human without a scapegoat? Now I want to bring up more of my thoughts that came out of that show, but came after it had occurred and aired. A few years after I started frequently, I will get through this, I will. Okay, a few years after I started frequenting men's rights forums and news groups, I realized something. For the most part, we were just restating the problem over and over again in those various venues. This conversation would be basically like this. Yeah, I know this is the problem, and this is the problem. This is the problem. I know that is the problem. Then also, this is the problem. And we'd just be pointing the problem out over and over again. And that's it. That's all we would be doing. And I recognized then that eventually we would all have to move beyond just stating the problem to actually doing something to solve it. But then, and for a long time, the problem seemed immense and impossible. I felt it was something that would take generations to resolve, if it ever was. That being the problem of creating a society in which has compassion for men. Greater compassion for men. We'd hope equal compassion for men and even equal respect for women's personhood, but let's not take it too far, right? There have been social problems that took generations to resolve before. Abolitionists live in a society where slavery was so fundamental they had to create their own communities of like minds to escape it. But those communities lasted centuries, and if you think about it, they ended up outlasting and outgunning slave-owning societies. Examining the abolitionist model of social change, I recognized there were no silver bullets. There was no appealing to media or the government or academia of the time to refute the lies that they used to govern, and there's no appealing to them now either. We need to make a community around the new moral knowledge of men's rights, just like the abolitionists created a community around the new moral knowledge of universal freedom and anti-slavery. That community may have to wait, maybe not as long as the abolitionists, since ideas spread faster now and they waited 5 centuries, but it would have to slowly grow, slowly build, and just apply subtle and ever-increasing ballast to the political landscape, waiting for the moment that slavery's foundation cracked, So the ideas and the abolitionist ideas thundered through the social firmament like a landslide. And that's what they did. They grew slowly, they grew subtly, but they never took the pressure off. So when that crack appeared, bam! They had it, the change. And then I realized I didn't have to wait for that community to be built around men's rights. I could pick up a shovel and start building myself. Over time, I built, with the help of the Badgers and A Voice for Men and Men's Rights Reddit and many other men's rights groups, I built a modest media presence. When you have an idea, a moral imperative that challenges the very foundation of society, like the abolitionists did, like we do, growth is slow, sometimes imperceptible, so modest is just fine by me. Slow growth is preferable to social collapse. And then, over time, I realized another thing. Most people know men's rights are an issue. They know a father, a brother, or uncle who's dealing with a deck stacked against them. In fact, you can divide the majority of the population into several categories, basically 2 categories. Those who know that men's rights are an issue and that men truly get the short end of their stick and care. But men's sacrifice is so much a part of our social fabric that they just think it's their role. It's men's role, just like it was a slave's role to serve. Men already know, and people already know that men have issues. Some don't care. Some have justified why we can just ignore those issues. Some don't think it's important enough to take a stand. Some think of sacrifice as a man's role. But they all know that men have issues. Even feminists know that men have issues. They list them as swiftly and completely as men's rights advocates do. And then they'll do their mental gymnastics to make excuses why they don't need to be addressed, which no one really agrees with, but everyone listens to. And then they all go on about with their business. Not because the feminist arguments are logical or rational or convincing, because they aren't, but because they throw enough mud and stink into the situation that people don't have to draw a moral conclusion and can thus safely continue on the easy path of ignoring men's issues. It's like the tobacco industry. They never really asserted that tobacco didn't cause cancer. They threw enough mud and stink into the situation that people didn't have to draw a conclusion and could simply continue on smoking without one. Or the slave-owning South. They called slavery the peculiar institution. On some level, needing to use a silly euphemism suggests they knew it was wrong. But they threw enough mud and stink into the issue, the possibility of black supremacy if you got rid of slavery, the necessity of keeping up tradition, that people kept on keeping on without having to make any kind of moral conclusion about the issue. It's what you do. When you know you're wrong, you just keep things uncertain. You just keep belching out a cloud of uncertainty. And even though everybody, if you point at any particular point in that cloud of uncertainty and you say, hey, this is totally illogical, everybody like, yeah. But it allows us to keep doing things without having to question them. So what can you do? And they keep going on. So how do you resolve this situation? It's exactly as difficult as that. How do you fight the cloud of uncertainty? All feminists do is create uncertainty around men's issues. All feminists do is, by creating that uncertainty, they make it so nobody has the moral imperative to do anything about it. And so we continue on, compelling sacrifice out of men in order to maintain our governmental institutions, maintain our media, and academia is justifying this whole situation. All you need is this cloud of uncertainty. The tobacco industry needed was this cloud of uncertainty. Just make it so nobody could draw a conclusion. And fighting this fog of war, raising awareness is not enough. As long as people embrace the uncertainty, raising awareness only increases it. As long as it's emotionally convenient to believe that it's men's role to sacrifice, nobody has to do anything about it. And feminists can continue to belch out their confusion and their nonsense and their bizarre acrobatics of illogic, and everybody will be fine with it. We'll just be like, yeah, as long as they're making noise, we don't have to address it. So how do you fight that? Once again, raising awareness only increases the confusion. Just adds more points to the cloud. Everyone is already aware and invested in excuses not to deal with the problem. So what you do is you look closely at the men and women who are deeply invested in recognizing men's issues and doing something about them. And you ask yourself, how do I make more of them? How do I make more of them? As many of you have probably heard, I'm doing another patron push to get the funds for a real-life badger cave. We need to get to our per episode amount of $1,500 so I can afford the cost of securing a space. Not developing it, just securing it. I've set a date of August 7th for getting there, and if we get to that amount by that date, Karen promises she'll send a promised hand sandwich that he demanded when she went on his show. I was recently asked why we need to have a badger cave. What's the point? Why doesn't your online presence serve? To that question, I'm going to say this. I'm going to describe something. There are moments when you face down men's rights and all of the implication it entails. When you see the enormity of the tragedy of the sacrifice. Before you is a field, an entire country of dying men, bloody and broken everywhere you look, hurting, empty, alone. You can hear the screams. You can smell the wet viscera, the puke and bile. And you slip in the blood everywhere. And you look up, and on a hill, slick with that blood, you see the black and rust engine of society churning out casualties, churning them out faster than the eye can count, churning them out with an industrial efficiency. And that engine is the government itself, buttressed by corporations and media and anointed by our priesthood, academia. Beside the machine, you see the traditional banners of war, calling out and demonizing the enemy. The enemy, they have unearned privilege that they stole from us. They rape our women and children. They hate us. You watch men walk into the gullet of that great machine, slipping as they do in the blood and gore it's leaking, and they walk, numb as cattle. There's a moment where you can no longer hear the screams of the men around you as you look at that infernal machine, big as a city, bigger, farting greasy soot and bleeding dead men, and you feel smaller than you ever have in your life. When you truly understand that you are just one person, one pair of hands, one face in the crowd, just one vote, and just one voice. And none of that means anything at all in the face of so much reckless, industrial indifference. When you come to that moment, you ask yourself, what do I do? What do I do? Do you rush into that crowd of walking dead and try to stop as men bleeding out as you can? Do you beat your heart against the endless tide until you too become a casualty? Suicide is always tempting in the face of defeat. Or do you step back as your heart breaks and look at the situation with a strategic eye? Do you ask yourself, what needs to happen to stop this? When you see a government waging war on its own people, you know you're in the battle of the heart. So you know you're in the battle of the heart. What do you do? In a practical sense, you start with the least injured. The sprains instead of the compound fractures, the contusions instead of the severed limbs. You start with the strongest, the healthiest. And you start with the promising soldiers, the men and women who can carve out a separate piece in the killing field. And the only soldiers worth a damn in the battle of the heart are artists, philosophers and storytellers, dreamers, technologists, archivists, jesters, music makers, poets, illustrators, puppeteers. Artists and dreamers are your army in this war on the heart. They are your spear tip and your shield. So what you do is this. You find them. You pull them out of whatever hellish isolation you find them in. You bandage them up and you give them what they need. Inspiration, wisdom, kind words, questions, resources, confidence, knowing they're not alone. Above all, knowing that there is somewhere for them to be, where they can be true to their hearts. And then you set those mad-eyed fuckers loose on the world. They will build the palisade to defend the dead, the dying, and those that will heal to become our medics and doctors. They will carve the roads for the supply lines where their hearts lead, others will follow, and they will follow gladly. So if our community manages to support its soldiers, the strongest of us in this war of the heart, to heal, to train, to get tougher, to get organized, to get armed, to build the fortifications and hold the line and eventually turn this shit around on that hellish machine, then how will we ever, if we cannot support them, how will we ever get to the point of making a dent in the walking wounded all around us? If we can't support this, how can we create a helpline for men that isn't constantly under threat of being shut down in 6 months due to lack of funds, or a resource for men that can't even advertise itself for fear of being cut to shreds by the reaction to the words men's issues? We have to move beyond virtual spaces. We can't rely on YouTube or Twitter or Facebook in perpetuity, sopping up the scraps they allow us. These issues are real-world issues, not online issues, so we need to get real. We need to thrust our standard into the bloody mud of this land, their land, our land, and say, here we are. And we can't send the walking wounded to hold that standard up. We need to do it with our soldiers. We need to set that standard in stone, defended by the only people who have a chance to fight back. And when the goons come to beat that standard down, our bleeding hearts and artists, our jesters, our storytellers, our illustrators and music makers will stand against them.